Alright, it is time to do another what if video. And today's what if video is, it's an interesting one. Not as interesting as the last one, granted, but, interesting regardless. Today we're talking about what would happen if Roses was a stand user. Roses was, the butler for the Joestar family from part 3. Uh, I don't know if anyone remembered him, so I had to bring him up, in case you guys forgot. But, I guess anyway, we're talking about him being a stand user and how that could have affected part 3. Uh, Realistically, he probably wouldn't go on the adventure, but we'll assume maybe he does. We'll talk about a scenario where he does, I guess, but like, realistically, he probably wouldn't, but we'll talk about a scenario where he does. Kind of to spice things up, if you get what I mean. So, yeah, I guess we'll talk about Roses in part 3. But before I do the video, this was a suggestion video suggested by Kujo. Yep, Kujo. I bet a lot of the JoJo fan base has PTSD once I read that name off. Okay, jokes aside, thanks for the request, and I will get to your video, or at least get to the story, because I don't want to waste more time. Let's talk about the story now. So, talking about how this version would go, now we do need to think of a stand. So, Roses' stand maybe goes after his naming scheme. He was named Roses after Guns N' Roses, from what I've heard. So, I guess a Guns N' Roses reference has gotta do. Well, I'm not too familiar with Guns N' Roses' discography, so I gotta have to think of some kind of name. We'll call a stand Chinese Democracy for now. I'm just joking. Oh, probably be Sweet Old Child of Mine or something like that. I'm not too familiar with Guns N' Roses' music. Maybe he can have Welcome to the Jungle. You know what? Actually, Welcome to the Jungle. And his power probably has to do with flowers or something like that. I assume he's probably got the ability to set off a plant that can actually use power like that. I think it'd probably be similar to Jorno's life giving, but he probably can't bring animals to life, only like plants and stuff. And I think maybe he can use them into very effective ways. For example, maybe he can create poisonous plants, maybe he can create poison stuff. I think it can have creative usages, and I'm going to call it Welcome to the Jungle because it kind of fits the naming there. And plus, I'd say, I guess to an extent, the jungle does have a lot of poison to it. In theory, he can also create fruit, and vegetables and all that kind of stuff, so it actually could be helpful, I guess, if the Crusaders need to eat or something. I don't know, these are just some, I guess, cool possibilities come out of it. But I guess we gotta talk about how or when Roses shows up. Now, off the bat, I really just don't see him showing up in the very beginning, if he's gonna be a Crusader. Now, realistically, I will talk about what Roses would do if he's not in part 3, and I guess how he'd affect the other parts. Even though I probably wouldn't put him in, and I'll tell you why, and I guess both scenarios why I wouldn't include him in. But, in my opinion, Roses would join when Avdol comes back from his head wound from Whole Horse. So after Avdol comes back from like the Judgment fight, Roses would come with him, and it would be revealed he has a stand too. I assume he probably gets a stand. Hard to say when exactly. Part 3 has such a short time period of when he could have gotten a stand. Maybe he has some kind of accidental encounter with Dio at one point. Maybe he, I guess, had some kind of encounter with maybe like Diavolo because, maybe he went to Italy with Roses one time. Not Roses, but Suzy Q one time. Maybe he just gets a stand, I guess, because of Holly's sickness encouraging him. Maybe he just gets a strong enough fighting will to want to save her. He would want to save Holly because he wants to save, Joseph and Susie's daughter. So he goes on the adventure to help her out. With him having a stand and the stand idea I thought of, so Welcome to the Jungle, that's going to be his, I guess, main gimmick. Well, I mean, the more I think about it, I think it'd have to be a tarot card reference. But I'm not too familiar with tarot cards, so, yeah, I'm kind of stumped. I'm probably just going to stick with Welcome to the Jungle for now. Maybe I'll change it eventually. Who knows? But the main point is, how does Roses change, like, the part? Now, in this case, I will talk about all the fights because, I mean, we're at the ending half of part 3 we're talking about, so, like, I don't really need to skim through it because I'm not taking a long time. So, in my opinion, the first fight we'll talk about is High Priestess, aka Middler. I don't think this arc could really change too much, except maybe Roses could, I guess, think of something creative to use as a stand with to maybe, I guess, hit the weird face thing that's the stand. The next arc is Nodal or Indol. I personally can't see him doing much in this arc either. Maybe he can try to help, I guess, Avdol try to fight off it, but like, that's really all I can imagine. But I could see Roses probably being holding some kind of attachment toward, I guess, Kakyoin, since he's very determined to, I guess, protect Holly and the rest of the Joestars. So he'd be sad to see Kakyoin get an eye injury and all that, because I feel like by that point, Kakyoin was still kind of young, and he'd probably be at least confused why Kakyoin's going on this adventure, even though he's young and should be doing school and stuff. And I'd say by that point, nothing much would really change for the Nodal arc, and I don't think Roses would play that much of a role. Boingo and Boingo is the next arc, and I think I'd probably just include him in there here. I still think we're obviously going to get like Polnareff and Joseph and Jotaro, or fake Jotaro in this case. And Oingo would probably just still pretend to be Jotaro and all that. Roses would be in this arc, but I really don't see him doing much. I think most of this arc would just go the same, to be honest, with Iggy still, I guess, pulling out the orange and, all of that stuff going the same. Oingo still explodes and stuff. After that is, I guess, Anubis, which would be the next arc, and then by that point, I really just don't see Roses tagging along for the Anubis arc, so that arc is still a Jotaro and Polnareff arc. After that would obviously be Mariah and Alessi, which those arcs go the same, but I do think Roses would just be included in one of those arcs. In my opinion, I assume he makes more sense being in the Mariah arc, since it gives him more of a use, I guess, of the story, since he really hasn't done much lately, except probably help out against High Priestess, and debatably against Nodal. But he can help out, and maybe him and Joseph can tag along here, I guess. Avdol probably can still be here, maybe, or maybe just replaces Avdol in this fight, and Avdol can maybe tag along with Jotaro and Polnareff against Alessi instead. Those are just some ideas there. I personally would just have Avdol go into the Alessi arc and just have Roses and Joseph do most of just the Mariah arc together instead. The next arc would be Whole Horse and Boingo or Older Darby. I don't remember which arc went first and which arc went last. But between one of those two, either way, I really can't see either one of them changing. I mean, Roses could try to gamble with Older Darby, granted, but I don't think he'd do too well. And then Whole Horse and Boingo really doesn't change, since none of the Crusaders even interacted with him. So I guess that goes the same, and we would get the Pet Shop arc with Iggy, and that stuff kind of just goes the same, because I still think it'd just be an Iggy-only fight. And by the end of the story, we'd obviously still get Kakyoin back from his injury. And when it comes to the ending, or at least the final half of the story, younger Darby comes in, and I feel like Roses would just go with Kakyoin, Joseph, and Jotaro. I don't think he'd be sticking around for the Vanilla Ice fight, in my opinion. It just doesn't seem like he would, and it seems more than likely he'd want to protect Joseph and Jotaro, especially Joseph, so fortunately, Avdol and Iggy would die, and even if he was around, maybe he could take Avdol's death spot, but I'm doubtful he would, and maybe he could, and I doubt he could honestly save Iggy. If anything, he'd probably just be an extra death for the story, and it'd probably just be more or less there to add more grief to Polnareff's character, but that's really all I could see if he's there for that fight, which I probably wouldn't include him in, and it seems unlikely he'd be in that arc. Now, I guess we go to the Dio stuff, and I feel like Roses would go with Kakyoin and Joseph at this point, since by that point, Roses would want to help them, but a big change would be that during the 20-meter almost splash scene, Roses would actually help Kakyoin, and Roses would want to be the one who stands out for Dio. Kakyoin would probably be like, no, I want to do this is my fight, and Roses could probably say something along the lines of, I don't want to risk you getting hurt, and I don't feel like it's your time to go, you're young and all that, yada yada. Roses is still kind of old, so really he doesn't have much of a reason to, I guess, really want to live here, since he's like in his late 60s, mid 60s, early 70s. So by this point, he would end up taking the place of, I guess, Kakyoin and taking the donut wound instead. This would basically lead to Roses dying, and Kakyoin would probably try to comfort him, and then Roses could use the last bit of his power to tell Kakyoin the world power, and Kakyoin would shoot at the clock tower since he knows if he tells them, Dio would just go after him. The rest of the fight mostly just goes the same, but instead, Joseph would actually get killed, but then get brought back, all that. And then instead, Kakyoin would help Polnareff, and I actually think Kakyoin would get his chance to finally fight Dio 1v1. Polnareff would obviously aid him in this fight, and it'd basically just be the, I guess, servants who are now good guys story. I guess the four more subordinates are now the enemies here, and they're going after Dio, and this could, I guess, lead to them fighting Dio and almost killing Dio. So I think that Polnareff and Kakyoin would both probably just get hurt in this fight, and I personally just don't see none of them getting killed. Maybe Kakyoin gets killed, and I guess that can just change really nothing to the part. And if anything, it'd just be a waste of Kakyoin. But in either way, no matter what, Kakyoin would probably just survive in my opinion. And really, part 3, I guess, goes the same at the ending. The only difference is that Kakyoin would survive and Roses would die in his place. Abdul and Iggy would still die, though, unfortunately, but in this case, we at least get an extra Crusader to come out of this timeline alive. In my opinion, that is. Now, I know I probably angered some people by having Roses probably die, but I'm just going to be honest and just... I'll do this one. Let's talk about a timeline where I guess either Roses just doesn't get into part 3, or if he's there, he just lives. Maybe Kakyoin and him both live, or maybe Kakyoin still dies and Roses is a survivor instead. Who knows? That happens. Well, if I'm being honest, he really won't show up in any more parts just because of him being old. Now, I guess if you want to bring up the arguments of each part, I'll just debunk them right now in this video, just so I don't have to answer those comments. Unless you have a rebuttal, then maybe I'll have to just rebuttal back. Okay, so part 4, Roses would have been watching Suzy Q over, and plus, at that point, if you've seen how old Joseph was and how terrible he looked for his age, there's really nothing Roses could have done here. If anything, yeah, he can't really do much in part 4. Part 5. I guess the same logic here. Assuming you wanted to replace Koichi, very unlikely Jotaro would really need him to do the investigation. Because at that point, he really just doesn't have much of a reason, I guess, go after Jurno. Someone like Koichi would make a lot more sense since his stand's just a lot more versatile in this case. In the case of the stand I made up for Roses, Jurno just has a far better version of that stand and generally would just be able to escape Roses a lot faster, due to the fact that Roses is just a lot older as well, so he wouldn't be able to catch up to Jurno. Now, assuming you want to have him, replace Polnareff or go with Polnareff, then I get it. I can see that, I guess, kind of working. But even then, it most likely end with him dying in the early 90s to Diavolo, when Polnareff got his legs cut off. So he can't really do much there, and he just gets hurt. And then by part 6, he's already ridiculously old. In fact, he's probably already dead. I mean, not to sound morbid, but it's the dark truth. He's around Joseph, Susie's age during part 3. Arguably a little younger. I mean, it's possible he's probably already died off screen. If he's even still alive, he's probably just too old to even do anything. Even with a stand, there's not much of a thing he can do, because he doesn't have, Hamon or nothing. Granted, he'd, destroyed a Yakuza with just, a super kick, but, I mean, even then, this was, part 3 Roses. The only time I could see Roses with a stand being useful is, part 3. Debatably, he can help Polnareff in the early 90s, but it end up with him dying, I guess. So maybe Polnareff doesn't become a cripple, maybe. Probably not, though, but yeah. I guess that's kind of really just why I personally would just kill off Roses here, because there's not much of a point to keep him alive past part 3. Unless you just want him to live a happy life, I guess. But for me, I really don't see any point for him to survive. He can die and take Kakyoin's spot to at least give Roses his own unique moments by helping defeat Dio in his own special, unique way, while also saving one of the characters in the process. Now, I guess to explain why Kakyoin lives, or what he can do after surviving, well, in this case, Kakyoin's probably at least somewhat devastated that Roses died so he can live. Kakyoin may even feel a little bit guilty that Roses was the one who ended up having to reveal the world's power, or at least take the wound instead. Kakyoin may think to himself why it couldn't have been him that day, and he could probably go through his own arc, I guess, where maybe like in part 4 or 6 he understands, I guess, Rose's sacrifice, and maybe Kakyoin can, I guess, pull off a sacrifice like that at the end. I'd say probably to help Koichi, but I don't see him dying in part 4. Part 6 he could probably die, maybe, I really don't know there. But by that point, I personally just think Kakyoin would actually be a survivor. And I personally just don't get much of a feeling on why Roses would really need to live at the end over Kakyoin. I'd say, if anything, it helps make Roses at least more important to the franchise to have him die to Dio over him surviving, because, I mean, we see Joseph. You really can't do much with an old man around this point, unless hormone hacks and stuff like that. But even then, you really can't do much with them. And I think that same logic really applies to Roses, who's near Joseph's age, if not a little younger, probably younger most likely. If he's older, then generally at that point, there's really nothing much you can do with him. Roses is probably already dead before the events of Part 6 even start. In the case of Kakyoin, he's around Jotaro's age, so of course he can definitely still be around for like DIU, Part 5, and he also got Stone Ocean. He can also he can definitely come into those parts. He'd be in his late 20s in like 4 and 5, and he'd only be like early, is it like 40 years old, 41 years old, around the same time Part 6 would have come. So in other words, he's like not really that old. And he's around Jotaro's age, so of course he'd have some kind of use of the story. And I could honestly just see Kakyoin having his own family at that point, and that could definitely help out for the future parts, with future Kakyoins to help out post part 3. But that's kind of really all I can think of for this scenario. Overall, if I had the final say and if I had to write the storyline down, Roses would have just died to Dio instead of Kakyoin. I mean, sure, Avdol and Iggy would still die, but Roses can get his own unique moment by actually getting to save Kakyoin at the end, which can actually help give Roses his own, I guess, cool moment of his own, and also can give a nice send-off to his character, and can also help Kakyoin in the later parts. So I hope you guys enjoy it. I especially hope you enjoy it, Jota, who requested this video. Sorry if I killed off Roses. I mean, if you're a super big fan of him. But I mean, to be honest, like I've stated earlier, he would have been too old to really do much, and there's really nothing you can do with a character who's too old like that. Hence why I normally don't really like having old characters live in anime, unless the character is like they're old but they can still fight. If it's one of those things, I'm cool with it. But a perfect example of a character who should die as an old man is like Joseph. Part 3 Joseph had no reason to show up in Part 4. Part 4 Joseph also could have died to Kira. Like, generally speaking, there's not much of a reason to have an old man live, and it really adds nothing to the plot. So for me, Roses would just die. If he lives, nothing would honestly change. Like, you can't really, unless you have like a counter argument, there's really no counter argument you can make, because I basically already stated why I think Roses can't really live, because at that point he really just doesn't affect the part as a whole. Him dying at least gives him that important role of the story, and it makes it feel like he's fulfilled his own, I guess, special fate, destiny goal by, I guess, like saving Kakyoin at the end and all that. So thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.